It's been 5 years since Oxenfree, the debut game from Night School Studio, was released, and I think it had been sitting in my pile of shame, waiting to be played for pretty much that entire time. The game is about a small group of teenagers who take a ferry to a remote island in hopes of staging a rager before the end of the year. A big party with drinking, dancing, and truth or dare, or truth or slap, as they call it, but you know, everyone does it different. But before the night can get in too far, the player character Alex and her new stepbrother Jonas unwittingly open a ghost rift in a cave using an old radio, and the night turns from well-meaning coming-of-age fun and festivities into an all-night affair with mystery solving, ghostly possessions, lost souls, and the search to make it off the island before Alex and all her friends are possessed and lost to the spirits for good. So you make your way around the island in a largely guided way, making a few choices about who to spend your time with, which way to go first, using your old radio to solve puzzles, uncovering past grief, navigating some old and new friendships, experiencing environmental anomalies and time loops, playing around with memories and general walking simulator stuff like that. It's something of a young adult ghost story type graphic experience with multiple endings, and it was well received at its time of release. There's no exact reason why I've waited 5 years to play this game, but I'm playing it now because I'm trying to turn a bit of a new chapter in my gaming, and this was as good a first step as any, sitting in my Steam library waiting to be played. What I mean by first step is my new desire to play and speak about games here on my channel which don't primarily involve killing as a mechanic, and preferably feature as little violence as possible while still telling a story. The best place to find that, and basically just new experiences which aren't what I'm used to, is in indie titles. I've spoken a lot about violence on this channel, and I've grown somewhat disillusioned with games which employ it as a central mechanic. I've found myself playing fewer and fewer games because violence is everywhere. And this isn't some moral issue, I'm not saying you're not allowed to enjoy violence in games. I'm just really bored of it, and I'm really bored that AAA releases in particular seem to view it as a comfortable space from which they barely ever move. It's all ultimately the same. Or I can take off my complaining cap and actually go looking for some different games. I want to see how video games consistently tell different stories, or if they even can. It's time for me to get out of my comfort zone, and I guess this video will be about that first step and what I'm thinking right now, as much as it's about Oxenfree as a game. It's not as though I'm totally unfamiliar with this style or genre of games at all, but to tell you the truth, I have a hard time naming what that genre even is. For lack of a better term, I have to call them walking simulators despite the derogatory slant that implies. I've enjoyed this kind of game a lot in the past. They're very popular, they're extremely accessible, have moved me deeply before, and I think calling them walking simulators or something like that starts creating these classifications of what is and isn't a real video game, and that kind of conversation I just don't entertain at all. Please get out of here with that shit. A video game is a video game. I don't care. What I think caused me to wait so long before actually playing Oxenfree though, or generally more indie games on whole, is the result of a lot of phenomena built by constant exposure to AAA, and what it teaches me to expect video games as a medium to provide. I expect for a game experience to last anywhere between 20 to 30 hours. I expect to be able to replay it. I expect it to take at least some level of skill to interact with. I expect it to provide me with constant dopamine feedback. I expect and have been taught that a video game, in short, must provide me with escapism from everyday life through a careful combination of routine, familiarity, tests of skill, and encouragement. The careful build of tension and release within controlled virtual circumstances. The form that most often takes is that I'm put into danger and I kill things to get out of danger for an extended period of time, and that is fun. This promotes, more than anything else, the idea that the game exists for me to play it and not for the creative fulfillment of the people who made it. I have a big problem with that idea, and it happens a lot less for indie titles, I find, where it feels a lot more like the people who made the game made it for themselves, and I'm simply here to experience it because it's not built around validation of the player. And then occasionally, after playing 2 or 3 new AAA releases, I'll play a shorter, slower game like Oxenfree as a palate cleanser, something to break the flow, and it'll feel like a really unique, magnificent, powerful experience because it is so different. I want to emphasize that. I'm not unaware of the idea that a lot of these indie experiences that I've played before, like Edith Finch, Beginner's Guide, 3 Fords Home, etc., could be very middle of the road for their genre. They might just be the titles that I happen to have stumbled upon, and that they have gained a supreme amount of favor from me because they use storytelling tools that I'm not jaded about. I don't see this kind of stuff everywhere. If you watch nothing but action movies, of course the first drama that you see is going to make a big impact whether it's actually good or not. I'm not saying that is the case, but it's potentially an element of why so many of these games have been so ridiculously highly regarded. They're so dearly needed as cleansers from an otherwise fast-paced, dopamine-focused design type. The question remains then, if I love these kinds of games, why do I play anything else? There seem to be 3 main alternatives to traditional violent video game design. The first is story-based games like visual novels or Oxenfree. The second is sport-themed games, and the third are puzzlers. Today I happen to have played one of the first kind. And this is what makes the prospect of, to me, switching to games like Oxenfree for my main diet a fun little exercise. I don't know if you can actually do that. Firstly, because there's an assumption, I think, that with these kinds of games that you can play them in one sitting. But then, because AAA games have trained me that a few hours a night after work is what I can expect, that means I'd need to find a new game every day, buy a new title every night. And I'm pretty sure folks are generally more comfortable spending a lot of money for one thing, one time that they can regularly get use from, than making multiple transactions for several different things they'll be done with after a night with no assurance of a good time. This is the first reason why playing story-based indie games or short titles all the time and nothing else probably isn't something people actually want. It's something they might think that they want. I can read as many Jason Schreier tweets as I like complaining that games are too long and that open world games are boring and overstuffed, but they're long to accommodate for what people are actually looking for in a lot of cases. The need to not commit, comfort, familiarity, and assurance of quality, the ability to come and go, time sink, and depth. Most indie games I've played have been a lot more polished, a lot more impassioned and original, a lot more punchy than AAA titles, and often more memorable given their brevity, but they don't provide me with these things that a AAA release does. I can chuck on a AAA game and half pay attention. I have to decide to play an indie game. It's not a question of what's better, it's a question of what you feel like on any given day. And if people generally felt more like super high quality, hyper originality and surprises more than they felt like comfort and safety, Marvel wouldn't still be making movies. I don't know about you, but sometimes it's just easier to know what you're looking forward to, instead of needing to work up the courage for a brief indie experiment that you don't know much about, and you don't know if you'll actually enjoy, that you might not even be able to talk to anyone about when you're done, because maybe no one else you know has played it. What I'm most interested in terms of what indie games offer that AAA games don't and vice versa, is that dopamine rush that so much of video game play inherently involves when it believes that a player matters. The constant tap on the shoulder which reminds you that you're actually involved in something. The validation that a AAA game constantly provides you with to trick you into thinking the game is worth your time. Games don't tend to leave you alone or operate on their own accord, and those that do often involve that centrally within their design. Real-time elements are used as a means of pacing and of play, but in an ordinary AAA release, the point of killing an enemy is for the game to provide you with a little, however small, moment of feedback and accomplishment. This hits you with that little dopamine rush, however innocuous, and can be big or small and create an actual sense of belonging within the world for the player. It indicates forward motion and, significantly, change. The best way to know if you're doing something wrong in a game is when nothing is changing, and removing something like a character from the world is the most obvious indicator of change. The biggest risk to take in the internet age of media, and especially in game design, is to do nothing. This could be a whole video in and of itself, but games often feel like they need to be constantly moving. You can even weaponize it against the player, like in horror games. The scariest part is when nothing is happening, because that idea of not affecting something is so strange, a space for a player to be in. And when you play a game like Oxenfree, the game has to write that contract between player and game very differently because it can't be constantly doing things. The way it communicates with the player is much less in the way of what the game is really about. The player has to learn patience. You don't have progression and achievement and a gamified exterior to distract you from the idea that, wait, maybe Horizon Zero Dawn as fiction isn't really that up my alley. Am I actually into this, or do I just like shooting stuff? This is the biggest difference between AAA and indie games for me. Without all of this dopamine and the common design parlance to employ and rely on, an indie game has to actually fight to be worth your time from even just a premise point of view. It has to actually be interesting. If a AAA game has good enough combat to interest someone on the combat's merits alone, the rest is just window dressing. It'll have an easier time appealing to people through multiple avenues, even if the core of it, aside from the violence, isn't really that intriguing. This is why I've been playing fewer and fewer games. I can rarely ever find the actual reason a game interests me. I'll use Cyberpunk 2077 as an example. I'm a huge fan of cyberpunk stories and that genre, but looking at 2077's execution of that idea, it didn't actually look like a good cyberpunk story. It seemed like I would only be interested in it for that futuristic aesthetic, which isn't enough. I can play Human Revolution again, a game that deals with the moral quandary of cybernetic enhancements and therefore ableism centrally within its fiction, something I'm actually interested in. And it's hard to know that it's okay to just not be interested in a game that came out. That is a full sentence. I am not interested. But with an indie game with a lot less money on the table, the game has to actually be interesting to a player for a player to be invested. It's so much further into its own fiction. The appeal of the game is much easier to see, and it's much more reliant on that appeal. An indie game is trying far less than a AAA game to be all things to all people. This became noteworthy to me in the case of Oxenfree more so than any other walking simulator I've played, and how long it took me to actually turn it on should be the dead giveaway. I'm not actually interested in Oxenfree, mostly because it's a ghost story. Ghost stories and the supernatural, in my case, are alongside westerns and maritime or sea fiction in that I'm not inclined to enjoy them. Not saying it can't happen, but whereas a story based in Victoria-era London will have a really easy time hooking me in given my interest in that time period, a story about pirates or cowboys has to be really, really excellent for me to give it the time of day. This also includes stories about ghosts, the paranormal and the supernatural 9 times out of 10. I just don't find them interesting. Supernatural stories, in my mind, are so heavily associated with low budget, low effort, cheap storytelling tropes that it's become a bit of a late addition to this category. They feel like easy stories to tell. And I don't like ghost stories not because they scare me, but because the exact opposite. I don't believe them. I don't care. And Oxenfree is a ghost story without an exterior reason for me to really care. So it's gonna have a hard time. My actual interest isn't there, and there's very little else for me to focus on. And from the get-go, it has another few additions to that mix, let's say things I'm just not inclined toward, which in my subjective case aren't the right moves for a story to make. Recreational drug use, underage drinking, stories about partying teenagers in general. Like, I already have written an album about how little I relate to this mindset. You can find it on my Bandcamp, and I'm not going to bother explaining any more than that. But I guess to get specific, the character of Ren annoyed me from the second he opened his mouth, and he didn't close it for like an hour. I just didn't find this a compelling opening. So subjectivity is much more in the picture for indie games, I guess is what I'm trying to say. These games are experimental, they're more freeform, and I'm more and less forgiving of mistakes within that frame. Because those things that I don't like won't as often be outright mistakes, they'll be active choices that I just don't enjoy. And sometimes it's hard to know when something I don't like is also bad, so I'll let it go instead. In general, Oxenfree uses the guise of ghost stories and the supernatural as its window into its more core themes, those being different responses to grief. It's good storytelling, using the fiction as the setup to get to what you really want to say, but by the same token, stepping into ghosts from a teenage party time is a step, and then from ghosts to grief is another. And if I'm not interested to take that first step by the time the game has taken the third, I'm well aware by that point that the game just isn't for me. And from the start, Oxenfree hits on a couple of familiar tropes for the walking simulator story genre, which I don't think helps it either. If you want to make a walking simulator game like this, you'll need basically three things. You'll need an isolated and largely abandoned, solemn central location, bonus points if the protagonist has been there before and is returning after a long absence. You'll need an air of grief, with bonus points for a recently deceased character or a broken relationship taking place just before the game's events. You'll also need, inside that location, old and obsolete technology to create light puzzle elements, with bonus points if you use the backdrop of they built it during war times to justify their presence. Oxenfree does all of these things, and for all its smooth execution, and it's a very smooth game, I just couldn't find anything original to hang on to. Maybe it was a pioneer of these kinds of things in this genre, but even if it's indie, I still feel like I've played this game before. The visual design is noteworthy, however, where it feels like an intersection between Don't Nod and Play Dead. Cross Life is Strange with Inside, and you'll get Oxenfree in more ways than one. Each environment has an interesting watercolor style with a glorious attention to detail on keeping the color theming of characters exclusive and making sure that they pop within the environments, but the environments don't become boring. It consistently uses motif to delineate characters and world elements in natural ways and doesn't make frequent mistakes on that front. Red in the environment indicates ghosts, but red in a conversation indicates the character of Clarissa, which actually foreshadows her possession. I was never confused about this stuff, about where someone was and who was speaking, while the environments remained clear to read and atmospherically engaging. The game has a mature, careful, and well-employed grasp on visual conveyance, particularly with its screen effects, and navigates its choices consistently well. I also enjoyed the camera in the game. It either feels like you're looking at the whole game through a spyglass from really far away, or as if the whole world was shot through a really long lens, compressing the depth of the environments behind characters. It's a distant-looking game while you're playing despite the simplicity. It's a really detailed and unique visual direction for a side-scroller, and I commend it very, very highly. The other thing that stood out as the game's focus was definitely the dialogue, which had clearly had a lot of time spent on not only the writing, but also the implementation of vocal takes into the software. Often in conversations in games, there can be annoying gaps between when one character stops speaking and when one starts. Even if it's just like half a second, it doesn't feel natural a lot of the time. This can be avoided by not having conversations and opting for monologues instead, but that's not the case here, and actually, the way that Alex can interrupt other people's conversations feels as true to life as maybe I've ever seen in a game.
So, Alex's turn?
Yep, lady's choice. Alex gets to pick who to ask something of.
Oh, great, here we go. What's your favorite stuffed animal? Professor Snodgrass, the platypus man?
Jonas.
Yeah?
Tell the truth. How do you really feel about your dad marrying my mom and the fact that we're now de facto organ donors?
Well, unless you turn out to be crazier than you look.
That'd be hard.
I think it's fine.
Only known her one night and is already fine with it. What a guy.
This also paired with something that I have a particular affinity for: silence as a consistent dialogue option. I fucking love this. In this game, there are always dialogue bubbles to choose, but they'll fade fairly quickly and the conversation will continue if you interject or not. Again, they nailed the pace of conversations really naturally. But since the bubbles fade, not contributing is a consistent element of dialogue. I love this. I love love this. A choice to not do something and not say something is still a choice, and it's something I think far too many dialogue games ignore. Quiet is a choice, silence is a choice, and it becomes a character feature too. For a writer, I often think choosing inaction is one of the strongest things you can do. And it seems like Oxenfree has prized conversations feeling natural and real way more highly than it's prioritized a player's involvement in said conversation. It's the direct opposite of BioWare. I think it's fantastic. The game employs a fun little technique that I've seen done a few times before as well, where another character will ask Alex something about herself, and all three options could be the truth. You're not lying, you're choosing which of these three is true. It's like picking your character's background and personality traits while the game is actually happening. And this involves the player in the character building and exposition in a slightly customized way. It's a really interesting technique which instantly involves the player in playing as a decisive, steadfast, rebellious character like Alex is, which is a pretty difficult thing to do. That being said, given the amount of dialogue here and its ability to just roll right past you without any player involvement, when it gets to speaking about action and actual game events, it can feel extremely vague, to the point where it's almost like the other characters aren't responding to what's actually going on or what I actually said. Take this moment for example, where a ghost has just suspended Jonas in midair trying to possess him while taunting Alex and Jonas with a game of Hangman. I failed the game, but the conversation following the event makes no mention of specifics that actually played out on screen, and doesn't match the urgency with which I would assume people who had just seen their friend levitate would naturally respond.
What? That was not fun.
Are you feeling better?
I'm feeling. Let's start with that.
This has been United News, and thank you for listening.
This is just unbelievable.
Specificity is sometimes really important, and at worst, it felt like the game was written way before anything else was done. So the writing avoided saying specific things because they weren't sure yet what was actually going to happen on screen. It leads to a disconnection between the dialogue and the rest of the game. It's for these reasons that I both do and don't think that the conversation mechanic was a success. There's a feeling at times, like in real life, that what you're saying doesn't really matter a lot, which a lot of games can miss. You just shoot the shit in this game. But at other times, conversations are really super important, and it was tough for me to discern which was which. There's this moment of player choice right at the very end of the game between Alex and the ghosts, which dictates the ending. I just steamrolled right past it because I'd been so used to just being disengaged with conversations by this point. You can also add in my general lack of emotional investment to that not really bothering me at all. Strangely, the focus on dialogue meant an overuse of dialogue and an undervaluing of what it really could do, and the more something is used, the less important it can feel. Oxenfree isn't a bad game by any means. I really enjoyed the execution, but for my lack of actual interest in what was going on in the world and its characters and its story, its best elements were wasted on me. It had some really great visual direction, screen effects, but its opening premise and its early music choices as well really just pushed me out. It was fighting an uphill battle from the very start in my particular case, and I suppose I was due for that at this point. Not every game is for me, and that is a-okay. This game was recommended to me by a friend, however, all those years ago, and the next time I see him, I might ask him what it was about it that he enjoyed, and hopefully get a little window into what he was able to find here. It's only 5 hours long, it was smooth and fine. I just don't think I cared very much about it. There's a definite deeper reason for that, in the difference between indie and AAA. I don't think Oxenfree as a story took a lot. The difference in a game where you kill and a game where you walk is that the former is so extreme. It's really high temperature storytelling. And I wonder how much of my emotional disengagement with Oxenfree is representative of a kind of high pain tolerance. I want to know how fiction operates when the stakes are lower, because honestly I don't know if I do in games. I don't know what that even looks like. Oxenfree feels like the start of that recalibration. That maybe it's not just the act of killing as a mechanic, but the periphery of violence and death inherent to so many games that creates such an extreme state of fiction that readjusting the guard to still be engrossed and impressed by stories that apply less pressure to me emotionally might take some practice. It's about sensitization. Maybe it's been a while since I played a game that didn't test my mettle to play.